Hey folks, Fernando doing a video for Tomorrow Survivalists, and in this video yet again taking a stab at the question of which is the best survival knife. This was asked in my Spanish channel, and I did a video that I think turned out quite well. Before I go on, I just like to say that I'm not having as much time as I used to because I'm working a lot on the translation of my latest book, Street Survival Skills, this one, which is being requested in my Spanish channel a lot. People want to have this book in Spanish. If you haven't bought it already, the link is going to be there in Amazon below. I think it's absolutely worth it, especially the topics, which are mostly, not mostly, these are all practical survival skills, strongly leaning towards modern survival, urban survival, self-defense, security, that kind of thing. If you haven't bought it already, give it a shot. Now, in terms of this topic, the question I got was the following one. This is from Tactical Jen. He asked, "I'd like to know your point of view regarding survival knives." This is one of those questions that is something I could talk about all day long. He says, "Do you prefer wider blades like the BK2 or narrow ones like the F1? If you'd like to do a video about it, that would be nice. Regards." So yeah, well, which is one of those questions in which you could talk about a lot. Now, if you want a simple, clean answer and just not waste any more of your time, the answer for me is quite clear. Today, for most people, the survival knife really that most people around the world could have with them and would perform a number of tasks and at the same time be with you when you need it is maybe not so much a survival knife, but maybe a multi-tool. This is, in my opinion, the kind of thing that would give you the most leverage, the most options for most of us. For most people, the thing you can have with you all day long is a pocket knife, and among those, the ones that have the most functionality is the current generation of multi-tools. You have a very decent blade. You have two very decent blades capable of doing most tasks that you would need for a pocket knife. Right, you have this blade. I was using this other blade, the secondary blade that it has serrations. You can use a tip for more final detail, and of course you have a ton of other tools. Even with the saw, it's somewhat compensating for the limitations of the natural limitations of a pocket knife. But the answer for most people today, it is going to be a multi-tool. I'm not alone in this line of thought. What's the name of the guy? The guy Survival Man from the Canadian guy. In his opinion, the best tool to have is a Leatherman Wave, which is basically the same exact thing as a charge, just the less fancy version of it. That is, in my opinion, the right answer for most people. And what I mean by this is that if you are park ranger in Alaska, yes, this is of course not going to be your best survival knife. That's a given. But for most people that mostly move around in urban environments and you cannot have any kind of fixed blade, this is the answer for you. If you're looking more for, if you want to have a Victorinox that fits your bill, go with that as well. It's not a bad option at all. If you need something more defensive oriented, you have a wide variety of tactical folders. Cold Steel makes some great ones. I would go with something like this, a big folder. It's not something that I'm inventing. It's not something, an original concept of mine. This is older than time. Spanish navajas have been used for self-defense. Big, huge navajas used for self-defense and for fighting in Spain since, I don't know, hundreds of years ago. If you have somewhat of a limitation in terms of blade length, a shorter tactical folder, yes. These are all viable options. In my opinion, the one that fits the bill, that does the most things you're likely to need, is going to be the multi-tool. A good multi-tool, Leatherman Charge, Leatherman Wave, or even the more affordable versions like the Leatherman Sidekick. Having said all that, which is the best survival knife, as in a fixed blade knife? Well, let's first take a shot at trying to determine what a survival knife is. That would be a good start. If I need a fillet knife, I can define that. I can say it's a knife for cutting and preparing fish. You need a narrow, sharp, long blade. Sure, that's kind of the idea, and we can talk about which is the one that does that function best. As for a survival knife, the survival knife is basically a knife that has to double not only as a cutting, prying, poking tool. A survival knife has to do all those other things that you would ideally use other tools for. What I mean by that is a survival knife needs to be it should be able to perform as a shovel. If you need a shovel, if you need a pry bar, it should be able to pry. If you need to smash, hammer stuff, it should be able to do that stuff as well. If you need to hack and cut a piece of wood, it should be able to do that as well. Not all of these knives are capable of all that. Some of these are quite handy, capable knives in spite of their limitations. But one of the things we'll soon see is that bigger is usually better. You know, again, it's not me saying this. And when you study these things, not just watching YouTube videos, which there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to be watching this video and you're going to be learning something for sure. But also reading actual books about knives, about blades and the different uses. One of the things you soon realize is that around the world, when people that have used knives as a daily tool for hours and hours each day through their lives is usually they use a lot of big blades, right? I can give you from my home country, Argentina, the facón knife, which is a large blade. This would be the typical tool a gaucho would have. A facón, yeah, usually they would use like a broken sword or a bayonet or forge a longer, larger blade. There's wider versions of it. This would be the quintessential tool of a gaucho. If you look at guys in the Amazon jungle, they would have a machete, something maybe not like this, or maybe some of the longer ones, but I've seen plenty of short machetes. This is one I modified a little bit myself. I did a little bit of a wooden handle, which is a little bit better, more comfortable. I like it more than the original plastic one. Modified the clip points a little bit. Years later, this is almost 20 years old. I don't even want to think how old this is, but this is one of the most handy blades I have. This is extremely functional, extremely useful, and this was way before Cold Steel came up with their own Bowie machete. The Bowie machete is a fantastic knife. Now, if you look at some of the knives, some of the frontier knives, you would have something not that far from this. A typical big knife. You see, if you look at some of those older pictures, you know, some of the older pictures from the, frontier times, far west, that sort of thing, you see a lot of large knives. That's where the Bowie originated, the idea, the concept of a Bowie. And if you know a little bit about knives, you know that Bowie is very hard to define what a Bowie knife is. Sure, most of us have somewhat of an idea of what a Bowie knife is. It's going to be a big clip point knife, right? That is what we all think about in terms of a Bowie knife. Is it going to be something like this? Sure. This is a big Bowie blade. Yeah. But historically speaking, Bowie knives, it really depended on the type of Bowie. There's the Rasen Bowie. There's a pile of different options in terms of Bowie. What they all pretty much have in common is it's a big pointy blade. And that's how the idea of the Bowie started. It was used in a fight, very effectively so, very widely publicized fight where Jim Bowie used his famous knife very effectively, but it's basically a big knife. That's what a Bowie is. Bigger is often better. If you can combine it with a smaller knife, you're covering pretty much all of your bases. We go back to the gaucho. He would have his facón. That would be his main knife, especially for as a fighting knife. Something to defend your honor, to defend your life when attacked by animals, by people, when your honor is insulted, when you needed something to cut grass, to anything that you would need a big blade for. He would have his facón, but he would also combine it with a smaller knife. This is a typical gaucho knife as well, the berijero knife, because it's carried appendix is kept handy. Many times this would be the first one he would reach for. The facon would usually be carried across the back. This one was kept in front and was mostly used for those ordinary daily tasks, those utilitarian tasks where you need a smaller knife for. Now, the gaucho was not worried about having this knife alone. He would just grab it from the blade itself, and use the tip. Kept sharp, it would be able of doing lots of these things. Now, the thing is that today we have this refound appreciation for smaller knives, right? And I'm leaning a little bit towards this side here with a typical puko knives, the Scandinavian type knives with a scandi grind. Maybe the more representative of that type of knife is the Mora. I think this is the clipper, basically a Mora knife. Extremely handy, practical tool for woodworking, for bushcraft. Bushcrafters love these type of little blades, and there's really nothing wrong with them. They're fantastic knives, but mostly as wood carving knives. You can do things with certain techniques. You can baton piece by piece and cut larger even branches or entire trees with the right technique, but it is more of a handy knife rather than a larger, bigger blade with more weight and different type of capabilities. A lot of the things that I mentioned before, can I use this as a prying, as a digging, as a chopping, as a hammering tool? Not so much. The small blade, though, has its value, especially some of the tougher, stronger ones. I have here the Haltaford's heavy duty, and Mora did a few heavy duty versions themselves of their knives. These are fantastic utilitarian tools. I've used some of these for cutting even metal, just using it as a cold chisel. These knives can take a beating. Maybe not the smaller Mora, but these ones, the heavy duty ones, or the Halterfords one, yeah, fantastic. This is a knife that I made myself. It's I think 516, I don't know, one of these pretty good steel overall, and it is extremely practical. A lot of the bushcrafter folks would like the idea that it has no guard and you can kind of get very close. Yeah, that has its value. I found that to be quite useful. I use this knife all the time. It's one of my most used knives. Of course, I like the fact that I did it myself. It's not pretty, it's not fancy. It does work. It's a thick blade. It holds an edge. It's not that much of a good edge that it holds because the Scandi type knives are a lot sharper than this one, but I find this to be very handy for anything that I need more of a strong tip for poking something and maybe then prying. I'm not worried about breaking it. I have a good idea of what kind of abuse this little knife can take. The little knife has its place. It is quite capable. Now, there's many instances in which you're lacking knife. You don't have enough knife, and that's where you start looking at longer blades. If you look at some of the more commonly used military style blades, you will see that usually they're not as short and small as those ones. A typical military a typical military knife would be the Glock knife. A Glock bayonet knife is a good representation of the typical fighting utility knife, more leaning towards the fighting aspect of it. The Glock is definitely more towards the fighting than the utilitarian one, than the utilitarian side, yet it performs very well in many utilitarian tasks. I've used this knife for cutting wood, for batoning. You can chop with it nicely. It's a very well-designed knife. I've talked about the Glock knife many times before. It's maybe one of the better options, especially if you throw in the pricing, the value that you get. It is a fantastic option, and they've often mentioned it as maybe one of the best survival knife alternatives out there. But going back to this question that I was asked, am I happy enough with a narrow blade or a wider blade? Well, the thing is this, it's basically a matter of geometry. What happens is that, for example, with this blade, which I love, I think it's fantastic, one of the best knives, maybe the best knife, the best survival knife out there. I'm not going to be complaining against that statement. Now, what happens is that when you have a wide blade and you have a narrow blade, when it's wide, the stock is it's a thick blade and it's kind of narrow. What happens is that the geometry dictates that the angle that you're going to be having in the edge is going to be a little bit bigger than if you have a wider blade. You know, if you have something like this, you have more of an angle, even if it's the same stock that you have, right? The angle is going to be steeper and you're going to be able to put a better, sharper edge on the wider blade. Not that you cannot make this knife razor sharp, which you can, but it's going to be less ideal than a scandi blade, you know, a steeper angle that just carves and shaves and carves wood much better. Still a fantastic choice. Now, if we're looking at maybe some of the more an improved proposition from this knife, well, one of those that I'm very fond of is this blade geometry that you have in the this is the Bessie Street Boss, I think it is. I don't remember all those names, but basically you have a long blade. It's almost the same length, but it's wider. This thing about the wider blade giving you a better angle so as to have a better edge for a cutting tool. This is more of a, again, more of a combat, stabbing, poking, killing tool. This is more of a tool that does all that, but more inclined to the practical cutting aspects. I know that the Street Boss, I know that this blade in particular has been bought by a few units. I don't know if it was some special forces guys or Navy SEALs or whoever it was that bought some of these from Bessie sterilized, which basically means has no name, no nothing, just the painted knife, and that's it. But I know it was bought by a few special operation guys, and I completely understand why that is. Of course, you have a fantastic steel in this blade. This is Infi steel. You also have a full tank construction. It's a tank of a little knife, a little bit heavier, yeah, than than the beloved Glock knife. Yes, it's gonna be heavier. It's gonna be a lot more expensive. $30, $300. You have to add a zero, and a full zero to the price range of this. But for some of those guys that really want the best of the best within the limitations of the weight that a soldier is going to be carrying around, then this is a great way to go. Now, as great as this knife is, and I love it, I think it's a fantastic alternative, just like the Glock knife, but these are knives for people that have the knife as a secondary utilitarian tool. Is not going to be their main blade. If we're looking more towards the survival knife, we keep on leaning towards the larger ones, and here is maybe where that sweet spot between what's practical, what's possible, and the ideal, we start getting closer to that. If you'd ask me which is the best survival knife, I'd probably start looking over there, the larger blades. Now, which is the best survival knife I can actually carry all day long in a realistic manner, if that is the situation I am in, which honestly, not for me and not for most of you, we're not carrying fixed blades all day long. But if we had to, maybe something like this would be a one of the best survival knives. And if you notice, some of these don't, 6-7 inch blade, wider blades. The K-bar would be a fantastic blade geometry for a utilitarian survival knife. Now, if I get to pick the steel as well, then I'm maybe going to be looking at some of the Bessie knives. Infi steel is some of the toughest, most durable steel you have, and with this type of blade geometry, this is the Team Gemini Light Brigade knife. I love this knife. I think it's a fantastic, and again, we're looking at a wider blade, a chopper, right? It is capable of chopping. It's not a specific chopper like some of the larger blades, but it does a pretty good job there, and because of that gray steel that it has, you're capable of putting a pretty nice, this is a knife that is capable of shaving, right? So it's a knife that shaves, and just after shaving you can use it to chop down a tree. This is maybe one of the best all-around survival knives in my opinion. I don't love the handle all that much, but Bessie came out with this one, the Soldier Dog, which is a 7.5-inch blade. Very practical blade geometry, and this rubberized rest spring C handle, very comfortable. Some of the other knives, in some cases, when you go with the extra mile, one of the things that I was being asked there was if I like the BK2. The BK2 is a great knife as well, and what it does is it compensates for not being all that long by having a wide, thick blade. That wide blade makes it a nice chopper in spite of not being all that long. Some of the straight knives that I have over there that I've shown many times before, those are good options as well. Maybe the angle is a tad too steep and you really cannot put much of a nice, a very sharp edge to these. Although you can sharpen them nicely, they're going to be cutting. It's not going to be cutting as nicely as some of the other knives. Then you have the typical survival knife, very 80s type of Rambo knife with a hollow handle. These are not bad options, especially this one. These are made by Aitor in Spain, and it's a very light hollow handle, but a very tough, durable blade. It's very well made. Because of the weight distribution, it kind of chops nicely in spite of its limited blade length. And you have the handles just to put some stuff in there. I think that that's a little bit dated. I think that today some of those things you're going to be carrying it in your backpack or maybe in the sheath itself, but a viable option nonetheless. If we go back to what we started with in this video about the bigger knife, I think that's where, if I really had to pick one survival knife for everything, you're telling me you can have just one knife for the rest of your life so as to do everything. I'm going to be going with a big knife. I'm going to be going with something like this, or actually this exact same knife. This is the Bessie Bushwhacker Mistress, a little bit narrower than the Battle Mistress, the Nuclear Meltdown Battle Mistress, which is a very thick 1/4-inch blade, maybe a little bit too heavy. I mean, I have Infi steel, I have fantastic steel, I have a lot of metal, and it's wide enough. Maybe one of the more functional, most useful knives is the machete. And I go back to this idea of the machete being such a fantastic knife all around. Not fully appreciated in the American market, I must say, because there's this idea of, no, it has to be super wide, it has to be super thick. Oh man, not so much. I mean, really, those guys in the jungle, in Latin America, in Africa, they have machetes, and they do everything with these things. Machetes are fantastic. Machetes are light, are fast. Yeah, therefore lighter vegetation. But you can still chop a larger branch if you want to. It's going to be taking a little bit more time. You're not going to be getting tired as much as wielding a heavier knife. The Junglas would be a good representation of what the American market thinks of a larger knife almost reaching that machete territory. But look at how wide the blade is. This is a thicker knife. This is actually a poor machete, a great knife. The Junglas, Essie Junglas, it's a great knife, don't get me wrong, it is. It's a poor machete though, because the machete has to be light, it has to be fast and light for carrying around, but for wielding and using all day long. This though is a fantastic big blade knife, like a frontiersman knife, you know, like a big knife like the BK9. Those are big knives that are able to do all of these things I was saying before. A survival knife should be able to do all those things that if you could, you would be using a shovel for, an axe for, a pry bar for, a hammer. All of those things, the big blade will do them better. Many of those things you can do with a lighter machete. This is something that I kind of realized a long time ago how practical the machete is, and I love the cold steel machete Bowie. I think the clip points works very well for it, so it's as a fighting tool. I mean, man, in Africa, machetes as fighting weapons, they are great. If you think of other parts of the world as well, if you think of the kukri knife, big blade as well, a utilitarian tool, something they've used in farms for working all day long. You know, one of the things I was reading is someone was saying that the actual kukri that Nepalese use is a lot narrower than the more available commercial one, the more demanded by the American market and the international market. You want to have a wide kukri. I was reading that the ones the actual Nepalese use, it's usually a lot thinner than this. It's more towards this, and I'm not surprised. This idea about the big knife being narrower, it makes a lot of sense because you have more steel, and because of the way that that steel is being distributed, this can take a heck of a beating without breaking and remaining light. And you have a lot of steel. This is not going to be super hard. You're not going to be sharpening it to what the American market demands of 60 Rockwell, because that's what a super knife does. No, this is going to be about 50, and that's fine because it bends, doesn't break, and it loses its edge. No problem. You have a lot of metal so as to keep sharpening this knife time and again. Trying to wrap this up, guys. The idea about the ideal thing, yeah, a larger knife, yeah, sure. I'm going to be loving my Bushwhacker Mistress, my Hunglas, my large, frontier dude knife. Practically, realistically, looking at what's the best in the real world within my real possibilities, maybe you're going to be going with this type of knife. Maybe for a soldier, the SRK used by the US Navy SEALs, it's a fantastic knife. Thick blade, but if you look at the stock, comparing it to your Glock knife, it is a little bit wider, and that extra a wide spade, that extra wider blade allows you to put a nicer edge on this knife. The SRK will take a nicer edge while still being capable of piercing like a combat knife, which is also something that a soldier definitely wants. More leaning towards still the utilitarian bushcraft outdoors aspect is maybe the BK7, and it's a very interesting story because this knife, maybe one of it's hard to say, it's maybe one of the most ideal all-around Goldilocks, not too big, not too small, but almost perfect size knife by Ethan Becker, was made kind of like in a, something that Ethan Becker was not very much in favor of. He was not in love with the idea of making the BK7. There's a great interview where Ethan Becker explains that he had the BK2, he loves the BK9, and this was requested of him. They asked him to make a K-bar. They asked Ethan Becker to make a K-bar based on his knives, and this was his answer to that. Now, as it sometimes happens when you do things in spite of not being super in love with the idea, he ended up with what is maybe his most utilitarian blade of them all, the BK7 fighting utility knife. It is a fantastic blade. It's being a little bit extra wide, maybe not as well suited as a fighting knife, but it's still capable of that. The extra wide blade allows for a very sharp edge. This cuts beautifully well, ideal for bushcrafting within the limitations of a larger knife. We're not talking about a carving scandi blade. We're talking about a big knife capable of chopping, fighting, doing pretty much everything. BK7 is a fantastic way to go. And then, of course, for more money, you have some of the nicer Bessie stuff, which again, look at finding that perfect impossible blade. It's really all about this, about having something that I can actually have with me. 7-inch blade, a little bit wider. Full tank construction, could be narrow tank. Yeah, these are maybe some of the best survival knives available. And the difference is, not so great. A little bit more of a clip point here and there, nicer steel here and there. This would be the Goldilocks. This would be the ideal survival knife if I could have it with me all day long. And this would be the realistic best survival knife for people in a reasonable budget and don't need to chop down trees and build a cabin in the middle of the woods, but have something that will do a bunch of stuff capable of doing that within a reasonable budget. Guys, that's all for now. I'm gonna be seeing you on our next video. Have an awesome weekend.